The glass was already on the floor, not broken, not spilled across the white linen tablecloth in some dramatic, cinematic crash that would have drawn every eye in the room. It had been placed there, quietly, deliberately, without a sound, by a woman nobody in that private dining room had thought to look at twice. The kind of woman Seoul's most powerful men looked through without seeing. The kind of woman who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of existing in the margins of other people's dangerous lives. The man still seated at that table, still breathing, still alive, still utterly unaware that survival had just been chosen for him by a stranger, was Kang Jae-won. Say that name in the wrong neighborhood of Seoul and grown men would find reasons to leave the room. Say it in a boardroom and watch the air change, the way air changes before lightning, electric and loaded with something that has no language. Kang Jae-won, 35 years old, head of the Kang Syndicate, a man who had built an empire out of silence and calculation and the particular ruthlessness of someone who had grown up understanding that the world does not reward mercy. He was not a man who frightened easily. He was, in fact, the man that other frightening men called when things went wrong. Tonight, something had gone very wrong, and he did not know it yet. The woman walking back toward the kitchen, tray balanced, back straight, eyes forward, was Zara Adeyemi. 27 years old, Nigerian-American, curvy and dark-skinned and unhurried in a way that read, to anyone not paying attention, as the quiet confidence of someone who had learned long ago that urgency attracts notice. She wore the restaurant's black uniform like armor. She had worked the dinner shift at Jeon's private restaurant in Gangnam for 2 years and 11 months. She had never once been late. She had never once been memorable. She preferred it that way. But here is the question that nobody in that room was asking. The question that would rearrange the next 6 weeks of both their lives into something neither of them had the architecture to anticipate. If you saw poison in a dangerous man's glass, a man whose name carried the weight of violence, whose hands had authorized things that decent people do not speak about, would you save him? If your answer is no, then stay. Because Zara's answer had been no too, right up until the moment it wasn't. What moved in her when she switched that glass, what ancient, unburied instinct rose up through 3 years of deliberate invisibility and made her hand reach without permission, she could not have named. Not yet. But Kang Jae-won was about to spend the next several weeks of his life trying to understand a woman who, in 3 silent seconds, had done something that no one in 15 years of empire and enemies had ever done. Nobody had ever moved for him first. Nobody. The man who had poured the poison was still in that room, smiling, refilling glasses, performing the warm, attentive theater of a trusted advisor who cared deeply about the comfort of his boss and their guests. He did not know she had seen. She did not know that within 48 hours he would find out. And the most dangerous man in Seoul was sitting at his private table, holding a glass he had not yet raised to his lips, watching a waitress disappear through a set of swinging kitchen doors, with a single thought lodged behind his careful, unreadable eyes. Who is she? Welcome to Soul of Africa. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications. We have so many more stories waiting for you, and every single one of them hits deeper than the last. Zara Adeyemi did not come to Seoul chasing something. She came to Seoul running from what she had already lost. 3 years before that dinner, she had been someone. Not in the way powerful men are someone. Not in the way that clears rooms or commands silence. She had been someone in a quieter, more precise way. Dr. Zara Adeyemi, toxicologist, Lagos University research graduate, the youngest specialist the AMBW Research Institute in Gangnam had hired in a decade. She had earned that position through 4 years of work so meticulous it bordered on obsession. She understood compounds the way musicians understand sound, intuitively, physically, in a language that lived below conscious thought. She had trusted her field. She had trusted the data. She had, with the particular faith of someone who had worked hard enough to believe the world rewards integrity, trusted the people she worked alongside. Her supervisor, Dr. Park Hyun-soo, had been exactly the kind of man she trusted most. 60 years old, silver-haired, the sort of brilliant that announces itself through patience rather than performance. He had mentored her from her first week, taught her the institutional rhythms of the institute, introduced her to the right people with the right warmth. He had the manner of a man who genuinely enjoyed watching younger scientists grow. He smiled when he shook her hand. He had been falsifying compound test results for 18 months. A pharmaceutical client, a set of trial compounds that were producing neurological side effects in a community population study near Incheon. The kind of side effects that were difficult to trace, easy to attribute to other causes, impossible to act on without the data that Dr. Park had been quietly, systematically adjusting. Children were getting sick. Adults were developing symptoms they could not explain. A community was slowly accumulating damage that had a source, a cause, a name. And the man with the authority to name it had instead been protecting a client's commercial interests with the elegant, undetectable precision of someone who had done this before. Zara found the discrepancy on a Tuesday evening in October, working late because she always worked late. A data set that didn't reconcile, numbers that, to an untrained eye, would have looked like acceptable variance. But to her, to someone who had spent thousands of hours learning exactly what acceptable variance looked like, felt wrong in the way a single false note feels wrong to a trained musician. She checked it twice. She ran the comparison against the original compound profiles. She triple-checked. Then she walked down the corridor to Dr. Park's office and knocked on his door. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had already made his calculation. Not cold. That was the thing that would stay with her. He looked warm, paternal even, the way he always looked. "Zara," he said, "you are extraordinarily gifted, and you are entirely too new here to understand how institutions protect themselves. File this away. Go home tonight. Sleep. We'll talk in the morning." "People are sick," she said. "Real people, children in Incheon." He looked at her for a moment with something that might, in a different man, have been regret. "Everyone gets sick sometimes, Zara. That is the nature of the world." She did not file it away. She went to the Institute's ethics board. She compiled her findings into a 40-page report and submitted it with every cross-reference, every data point, every comparative analysis she could construct. She filed a parallel complaint with the government regulatory authority. She sent documentation to 2 separate journalists who covered pharmaceutical accountability. She did everything that the institutional guidelines said a person in her position was obligated to do when they discovered evidence of research fraud causing community harm. The institute closed the ethics investigation in 11 days. Her employment contract was terminated in 14. Dr. Park kept his office, his title, his reputation, and his smile. The client retained their approval. The community in Incheon continued to report elevated neurological symptoms for another 7 months before a different researcher at a different institution found a different piece of the same problem. Zara packed her apartment in 3 hours. She left Seoul and went back to Lagos and spent 4 months trying to find a position in her field, discovering systematically that her name now appeared on a professional blacklist she could not see or contest. She applied for 31 positions. She received 29 automated rejections and 2 interviews that ended the moment the interviewer left the room to make a phone call. She returned to Seoul because it was the only city that felt like a wound she hadn't finished understanding. She took a job waitressing at John's because the restaurant hired staff who didn't ask detailed questions and paid on time. She kept her test kit in her apron pocket every day, not because she expected to use it, because throwing it away would have meant accepting that the person she had been was permanently gone. 3 years passed. She became excellent at being invisible. She became, in fact, so accomplished at it that the restaurant's most dangerous regular had sat at her table 14 times without once meeting her eyes. Until the night she noticed his advisor pour a drink he should never have touched. The restaurant existed in the kind of hushed, orchestrated luxury that functions as a form of intimidation. Dark wood, low candlelight, booths deep enough to conduct business without being overheard. The kind of establishment where the clientele paid not just for the food, but for the privacy, and the staff were trained, through a combination of explicit instruction and daily social reinforcement, to be invisible, to move through the room like weather, to anticipate without intruding, to witness without retaining. Zara was the best of them at this. She had, after all, been practicing. Her co-worker Minji caught her elbow at 8:47 p.m. as she was loading her tray at the service station near the entrance of the private corridor. Table 9. Minji's voice was 3 notes lower than her normal register, the tone she used when something mattered. Private room. You're covering tonight. Don't be slow. Don't be memorable. Don't make eye contact with anyone who hasn't spoken to you first. That's the Kong table. Zara looked at her. Who is Kong? The pause that followed was approximately 2 seconds long. In those 2 seconds, Minji's expression moved through 4 distinct emotions before settling on something that looked like careful neutrality stretched thinly over genuine fear. The kind of man, she said finally, that you pray never learns your name. Kang Jae-won did not look like power in the way that people who have never been near real power imagine power looks. He did not perform. He did not command the room with volume or gesture or the theatrical displays of authority that insecure men use to signal what they lack. He simply occupied space in a way that made every other person in the room, unconsciously, involuntarily, arrange themselves around him. 35 years old. A face built for concealment, sharp jaw, level eyes, the kind of bone structure that registered as handsome from a distance but, up close, communicated something more architectural than attractive. His suit was not expensive in an ostentatious way. It was expensive in the way that things are expensive when cost has become irrelevant. He sat at the head of the table with the ease of a man who understood that power is not something you project. It is something that leaks out of you whether you want it to or not. To his left, conducting the table with easy brilliance, was Lee Min-jun. 40 years old, the kind of attractive that photographs well. A man who smiled with his whole face, the eyes included, which was, Zara had learned during her toxicology training, one of the harder social signals to fake, which meant that men who had learned to fake it were particularly dangerous. He was refilling the drinks of the visiting Chinese syndicate delegates with the warm, personal attentiveness of someone who found genuine pleasure in taking care of people. He laughed at the right moments. He translated between Korean and Mandarin with a facility that made it look effortless. He leaned slightly toward Kang when he spoke, communicating deference and intimacy simultaneously, the body language of a man who had long ago mastered the performance of perfect loyalty. Zara moved around the outer edge of the room, clearing appetizer plates, replacing a fork, attending to the table with the efficient near-invisibility that 2 years of practice had made automatic. She was thinking about nothing in particular. She was certainly not watching Min-jun, until she was. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that her brain registered before her conscious attention caught up. The way a trained ear catches a flat note before the mind has named what it heard. Min-jun reached for the whiskey decanter that sat to Kang's right. Zara's hands continued moving. Her face continued holding its professional neutrality. But something underneath all of that went absolutely, electrically still. Advisors do not pour their bosses drink. This was not a rule she had been taught at any restaurant. It was older than that. It was the rule of proximity and power, the rule that exists wherever one person's survival depends on controlling what enters their own body. You pour your own drink, always, especially when you are the kind of man whose enemies are creative. You do not hand that control to someone else, not even, especially not, someone you trust completely. Zara had noticed this pattern at John's on her second week. She had filed it away the way she filed away everything, not for any particular purpose, simply because her brain did not know how to stop cataloging data. Minjun poured Kang's drink with his body turned approximately 15 degrees away from the rest of the table. Just enough to use his shoulder as a blind, just enough to create 3 or 4 seconds of privacy that looked from the perspective of anyone watching the delegates, like an entirely normal movement. His other hand stayed on the table, open, relaxed. His face was turned toward one of the delegates, still smiling, still mid-sentence. Nobody saw it. In the entire room, 12 people, every one of them trained in some form of situational awareness. Not a single person registered it, except the waitress who had spent 3 years learning to see the things that happen in plain sight while everyone is looking somewhere else. The thoughts that moved through Zara's mind in the next 4 seconds were not dramatic. They were not accompanied by fear or urgency or the cinematic clarity of a movie hero in the moment of decision. They were the flat, clinical, unbidden assessments of a toxicologist who had never stopped being one regardless of what she wore to work. She was 15 feet from the table. She had one more appetizer plate to clear. She had a clean glass already loaded on her tray. Standard practice, she always carried extras. She had her test kit in her left apron pocket, where it had lived every day for 3 years. She had 8 seconds before Minjun would finish his pour and Kang would reach for the glass. She was walking before she had finished deciding. She reached the table on the far side, closest to Kang's setting. She reached across, efficiently, professionally, the movement of a server who has done this thousands of times, and lifted 2 empty appetizer plates with her right hand. Her left hand, holding the tray at the table's edge, was invisible to everyone in the room from this angle. She set the clean glass from her tray directly onto the surface. She lifted Kang's glass in the same motion, not slowly, not hastily, not with any quality that would distinguish it from the 10,000 identical movements she had made at this table over 2 years. The exchange took less time than it took Minjun to finish the sentence he was delivering to the delegate on his left. She straightened. She walked away. She did not look back. She did not permit herself to breathe differently. She moved through the dining room at exactly the same pace she always moved, pushed through the kitchen door, walked past the prep stations and the line cooks and the second service waitress prepping dessert courses, continued straight to the back of the kitchen, turned into the dry storage corridor, and pulled the door closed behind her. Then she exhaled. Her hands were steady. She made note of this, not with pride, simply with the dispassionate accuracy of someone taking inventory. 3 years of surviving quietly had taught her body to bank the panic somewhere internal, somewhere smaller and more contained than her hands. She could fall apart later. She had been falling apart later for 3 years. She pulled the test kit from her apron pocket, removed a strip, dipped it into the glass she had carried from the dining room, set it on the shelf in front of her, and watched the clock on her phone. 40 seconds. The strip changed color the way a bruise blooms. Slowly, then all at once, the purple-gray spreading from the center outward in the particular pattern she had cataloged in a toxicology training module 6 years ago. Tertiary alkaloid compound, synthesized, adjusted for delayed onset, meaning it was designed to present no immediate symptoms, to allow a man to finish his dinner, to drive home, to perhaps spend an hour in his private space before his body began to understand what had been introduced to it. Odorless, tasteless, lethal in the concentration now registered on the strip within approximately 90 to 100 minutes of ingestion. She stared at the strip for a long time. She thought about Dr. Park, about his warm eyes and his easy smile and the 40-page report that had been filed and dismissed and buried in 11 days. She thought about the 14 days after that. She thought about the 31 applications and the 29 automated rejections and the 2 interviews that ended the moment someone made a phone call. She thought about the fact that she had just saved the life of the most powerful criminal in Seoul, and that there was nobody in the world, nobody, who would ever believe her version of what had happened tonight. She said, to the dry storage room, to the stacked boxes of jasmine rice and the shelf of cleaning supplies and the cold, indifferent air. "Zara, what did you do?" She saw the car before she saw him. Black, no plates visible, parked at an angle that was technically legal but communicated to anyone reading the language of vehicles belonging to men like Kang Jae-won that legality had not been the primary consideration. Parked directly adjacent to the staff entrance, which told her everything. He was not here as a customer. He was not here to eat. She stood on the pavement for approximately 4 seconds. She could call in sick. She had sick days accumulated. She had worked every shift for 11 months without absence. She could disappear for a few days, let this calcify into something she would address when the immediate danger felt less immediate. She could choose, as she had chosen so many times in the past 3 years, the path of least exposure. She tied her apron strings, pushed open the staff door, and walked into the building. He was sitting at the bar, no visible security, which did not mean there was no security. It meant the security was good enough that she couldn't identify it. A cup of coffee sat untouched on the counter in front of him. He was not looking at the door when she entered. He was looking at his hands. But she had the distinct impression, the specific calibrated impression she had developed over years of learning to read rooms, that he had known the moment her foot crossed the threshold. She walked behind the counter, began the morning setup routine, coffee machine, juice station, glass polish, moving through the familiar choreography with the careful focus of someone who had decided in advance that normalcy was her only viable strategy. "You switched my glass." His voice was exactly what she had expected. Low, unhurried, not a question. The declaration of a man stating a fact he has already verified. "Good morning." She did not look up from the coffee machine. "We open at 9. Can I offer you the breakfast menu?" I retrieved the original glass. I had it tested. Her hands went still. Not long, half a beat, the kind of stillness that only registers if you are specifically watching for it. She resumed polishing. "Then you have your answer. You don't need anything from me. I need to understand who sent you." "Nobody sent me." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. She could feel him looking at her, not with the casual, dismissive gaze that men like him typically directed at women like her in places like this, but with the particular unnerving focus of someone assembling a picture from individual pieces. "Women do not walk into a room full of my security detail and manage a substance they had no business identifying, without a reason." She set down the glass she had been polishing. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Not with defiance, not with the performance of bravery that frightened people use to mask their fear. She looked at him the way a woman looks when she has already been destroyed by a system more powerful than her, has survived the destruction, and has come out the other side with nothing much left to lose. "I did not do it for you." Something shifted in his expression. Not softeningness. Kang Jae-won did not have soft expressions in his repertoire. What moved across his face was faster and less legible than that. A recalculation. The kind of adjustment a person makes when the variable they were certain of turns out to be something different. "Then who," he said, "did you do it for?" She said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, a slight movement, barely perceptible, and regarded her. The calculation behind his eyes was still running. But underneath it, something else had appeared. Something that had no name in the vocabulary he had spent 15 years building. He had met operatives, infiltrators, professionals of every variety. He had sat across tables from people whose entire purpose was deception. He had never once met someone who looked at him the way this woman was looking at him. Not as a threat, not as a resource, not even as a danger. She was looking at him the way a person looks at a situation they are simply trying to navigate without incurring further damage. He left before the restaurant opened. But that evening, he came back. He sat in her section, not the private dining room, the main floor, her station, and ordered dinner without requesting anything private or exceptional. He ate slowly. He said nothing about the morning. He said nothing about the glass or the kitchen or the test strip. He left a folded envelope under the edge of his plate when he stood to leave. Inside it, she found enough money to cover 2 months of her rent. No note, no explanation, no expectation visible. She brought him his water that evening before he asked for it. He noticed. She saw him notice. The fractional pause, the way his gaze moved to the glass and then to her retreating back, the way the set of his jaw shifted by something that a less attentive person would not have registered as a shift at all. Two people communicating in a language that did not yet have words. What neither of them knew yet, what neither of them could have known, standing on opposite sides of a restaurant counter in the careful early stages of something neither had consented to, was that the man who had poured that drink had already made his next move. Lee Min-jun was not a man who panicked. He was, in fact, almost incapable of panic, a quality that had made him invaluable to Kang Jae-won for 4 years and had, simultaneously, made him genuinely dangerous in a way that Kang had been too comfortable to notice. Min-jun had access, not just to Kang's schedule and his business decisions and the logistical infrastructure of the syndicate. He had access to the source code, the relationships, the names that were never written down. He had spent 4 years making himself indispensable while quietly, with extraordinary patience, redirecting capital and influence toward a rival faction that had offered him a position he would never have earned through legitimate means. The poison was not impulsive. It had been the final movement of a strategy that was 22 months old, carefully timed to coincide with a period when a deal with the Chinese faction would provide a convenient suspect, elegantly constructed to appear as a rival assassination rather than an internal betrayal. Entirely dependent on a single assumption, that the woman assigned to table 9 that evening was furniture. At 10:47 p.m., 3 days after the dinner, Min-jun received word that Kang had initiated a financial investigation. The source was inside Kang's own security office, one of 2 people Min-jun had recruited over 18 months of careful, patient work. He made 3 calls. He did not raise his voice during any of them. He ended each one with a specific instruction. Then he folded his hands on his desk and thought carefully, for 11 minutes, about the variable he had underestimated. The waitress. 2 men were dispatched to the street outside Zara's subway station that same evening. Their instructions were not to harm her. Harming her would create evidence, which Min-jun had spent his entire career avoiding. They were instructed to walk close enough behind her for long enough that she understood, viscerally, that being seen carried a cost. A message delivered through proximity. The kind of communication that leaves no fingerprints. They reached the street. They found her. They also found 4 men who had been trailing Zara Adeyemi since 10 p.m. that evening, stationed, positioned, and briefed by Kang Jae-won's head of security 9 hours earlier. She got into the car because there was nowhere else to go. She understood this with the cold practicality of someone who had learned, through expensive experience, that the performance of choice in a powerless situation is still, ultimately, performance. She sat with her arms folded and her face arranged into the composed expression she had been wearing as daily armor for 3 years. She did not look at him immediately. "I do not need to be managed," she said. "I am not a situation you are handling." "I know that." He was looking at the window. Seoul moved past in long amber streaks. "Then why?" "In 15 years," he said, and his voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but stripped of something, the way a surface looks when the lacquer is removed, and what is underneath is neither better nor worse, but simply more true. "Nobody has moved for me first, not without a reason they eventually presented, not without a cost that appeared later. You cost me nothing. You gave me everything." The pause that followed was long enough to have its own weight. "I don't have a vocabulary for that. This is the only response I know." She looked at him. He was still watching the window. The city's light moved across his face in intervals, illuminated, then dark, then illuminated again. And in those intervals of light, she saw something she had not expected. Not the calculation, not the authority. Something underneath both of those, something that existed prior to the empire and the reputation and the 15 years of learning to be the most dangerous person in any room. He was a man who had been profoundly alone for a very long time and had built an entire identity around not noticing it. She looked away. The car was quiet. Seoul continued outside, enormous and glittering and entirely unconcerned with either of them. What woke up in that silence between them was not love. It was too angular for love, too uncertain, too caught between resistance and recognition. It was the particular disorientation of encountering someone whose damage is arranged differently from yours, but is structurally familiar. The specific ache of seeing a person who has become fluent in self-protection and knowing, against every reasonable instruction your history has given you, that you are reading them correctly. She looked at the window. He looked at the road. Neither of them spoke again. Neither of them needed to. Within 48 hours of the dinner, Kang had ordered an audit. Not dramatic, not announced. The way he did everything, quietly, from multiple directions simultaneously, designed to prevent any single person from understanding the full shape of what was being examined. What the audit produced made him set his pen down on the table with a steadiness that only someone who knew him well would have recognized as the equivalent of another man throwing something across the room. 22 months of redirected capital, not clumsy, surgical. The kind of financial diversion that required intimate knowledge of the syndicate's accounting structures, its legitimate business arms, its legal entities, the timing of its major transactions, the kind of knowledge only 2 or 3 people in the entire organization possessed. The funds were moving to a holding structure registered to a shell company that traced, through 4 layers of corporate insulation, to the Cho faction, the syndicate most positioned to benefit from Kang's absence. The poison had not been an act of desperation. It had been a conclusion, the final line of a story that Minjun had been writing for nearly 2 years. Kang sat with this for 4 minutes without moving. Then he called his security head and issued 3 instructions in 40 seconds. Then he sat for another 3 minutes. Then he drove to John's. He found her on the back concrete steps of the restaurant during her break, 40 minutes before the dinner service opened. She was eating from a small container, rice and greens portioned with the careful economy of someone on a fixed budget, with earphones in and her eyes on the middle distance, on the Han River barely visible between the buildings, on something private that had nothing to do with him. She pulled one earphone out when she heard the door. She looked at him. She did not stand. She did not rearrange herself. She simply absorbed his presence with the same flat equanimity she seemed to bring to everything, and waited. The man who poured my drink. He sat down beside her on the concrete step. No chair, no distance, no architecture of power between them. Just the city and the evening and 2 people with the same kind of damage arranged differently. Did something happen to you before? Something like that? She regarded him for a long time. The city made its ambient sounds below them. Why does it matter to you? Because it changes what I owe you. Another silence. This one felt different. Not the silence of 2 people withholding information from each other, but the silence of one person deciding whether a closed door is still necessary. She told him. Not in the practiced, compressed way she had told no one. She had told no one, not BC. Not any of the colleagues who had briefly been her allies before the system processed them away from her. She told him the way water moves through a crack, not with force, simply with the pressure of something that has been contained too long finding the first available opening. Dr. Park, the data, the children in Incheon, the 40-page report and the 11-day investigation and the 14-day termination, the 31 applications, the 2 interviews that ended with a phone call, the return to Seoul, and the 3 years of choosing invisibility as the only strategy that had not yet cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. He listened without once interrupting. This, she would think later, was the thing that undid her composure more than anything else. Not his physical presence, not the strangeness of sitting on concrete steps with the most powerful criminal in the city, but the quality of his listening. He listened the way a person listens when they have made a deliberate decision to hear rather than to evaluate, without the reflexive calculation that powerful men typically apply to other people's pain, the unconscious assessment of what it means for them, what it costs, what advantage it represents. He simply listened. When she finished, the silence between them held differently. "You didn't switch the glass for me," he said. "I switched it because I had already stood in a room and watched a man with a warm face do something invisible and irreversible, and I had walked away." She was looking at the river. "I was not going to watch it happen again, not even for a man like you." He looked at her for a moment with something that was visible and unguarded in a way his face was not accustomed to being. "Especially a man like me, you mean?" She did not answer, but she turned her head fractionally in a way that was not quite agreement and not quite denial. "I don't decide who deserves to live," she said finally. "That is not a decision I have the standing to make. What I had was evidence and training and 8 seconds, so I used them." He nodded once. Something in the line of his shoulders changed. Not much, but she noticed it. Min-jun had prepared for the investigation. He had prepared, in fact, for every version of this moment he could model. He was a man who had built his entire life on the careful management of contingencies. The financial trail would be found. He had accepted this the moment the audit was ordered, 48 hours earlier. What he had prepared was the counter-narrative, a story elegant enough to create doubt in a room where doubt was the only weapon he had left. The waitress, a foreign national with a grievance against Korean institutional structures, a woman who had lost a prestigious position under opaque circumstances, a woman who carried a test kit in her uniform pocket, which was, he had decided, the most compelling detail. Who carries a test kit unless they came prepared to find what they were looking for? He had built the story methodically, filling it with enough technical specificity to require effort to disprove. He had arranged for the meeting, framed as a conflict resolution session, the kind of internal arbitration that the syndicate occasionally used to adjudicate disputes. He had made sure it would happen at John's, at Table 9, because he understood the psychology of location. He had not accounted for the fact that Kang would bring her. She stood near the door in her restaurant uniform, hands loose at her sides, back straight. She had been informed 2 hours earlier that her presence was requested, not asked, not invited, requested, at the meeting. She had understood what this meant. She had come anyway, not because she was unafraid, because she had been afraid before, in a smaller room with less power on the table, and had walked away from it. And she had lived with that choice for 3 years. Min-jun looked at the evidence spread across the table. Then he looked up and smiled. "Jae-won." His voice was the same voice she had heard in the dining room 3 weeks ago. Warm, calibrated, entirely convincing. "Before you proceed with whatever conclusion you've reached, you need to understand what I'm about to tell you. This woman approached me 6 weeks ago. She identified herself as having contacts within a regulatory framework and offered to provide documentation that would destabilize your position relative to the Cho faction. The financial record you're looking at is the result of a diversion she initiated through a contact in your accounting office. The poison narrative is her cover story, constructed to make her look like a loyal party while actually gathering information on your operation. She is the source of everything you are holding." Several people in the room had turned to look at her. Min-jun's smile widened fractionally. He had prepared this. He had practiced the cadence of it. He had identified which details would create maximum doubt in minimum time. Kang turned to look at her. His face was the face she had seen at the bar on the morning of the first confrontation, unreadable, entirely contained. She knew from 3 weeks of learning the specific language of his silences that unreadable did not mean certain. She looked at Min-jun. She looked at the table. She looked at the glass at Kang's setting. This one poured, as she could see by the security officer who had stationed himself at Kang's shoulder for the duration of this meeting. She spoke. The compound in the glass I removed 3 weeks ago was a tertiary alkaloid derivative. Her voice was the voice she had used in conference presentations 6 years earlier, precise, measured, carrying the particular authority of someone whose expertise is not performance but structure. Specifically, a synthesized variant of conium alkaloid modified for delayed onset to prevent immediate detection. The modification requires laboratory access, a Class B fume hood at minimum, and a specific catalyst commercially available at 3 regulated facilities in South Korea. All 3 facilities maintain purchase records. All 3 require a specialist license for acquisition. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I have not held a specialist license for 3 years. I have not had laboratory access for 3 years. I have had access to a restaurant kitchen, a dry storage room, and a set of test strips I carry because I have not yet been able to fully convince myself that the person I trained to be is permanently gone. Another pause. The license on record for the catalyst used in that compound synthesis, I believe you will find, if you make the relevant call to the regulatory database tonight, was last renewed under the name of Lee Min-jun 14 months ago. The room was silent. Min-jun's smile moved. It was a small movement. Not a collapse, not the dramatic unmasking of a man caught in a lie, which was the version of this moment that happened in fiction. It was something quieter and more precise than that. It was the fractional, involuntary dislocation that occurs when a person who is very skilled at performance encounters the exact truth about themselves stated at exactly the right moment by exactly the right voice. The smile did not disappear. It simply ceased to be connected to anything beneath it. Every person in that room saw it. Kang Jae-won, who had spent 15 years becoming fluent in the distance between what people showed and what they meant, saw it in the first half-second. He exhaled. A small, controlled sound. He set his hands flat on the table surface in the way he set them when he had reached the end of his calculation. "Take Min-jun," he said quietly to the security officer at his left. "Somewhere he can think carefully about the next conversation we will need to have." Then he looked at her. She was already turning toward the door. She had done what she came to do. She had no interest in witnessing whatever came after, not because she lacked the stomach for it, but because it was not hers to witness. She had spoken the truth in a room where truth was the most dangerous currency available, and she had done it for the second time in her life, and this time nobody was going to file her complaint in 11 days and terminate her contract in 14. She was at the door when he spoke. "You didn't need to come tonight." She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She stood with her hand on the door frame and the corridor open ahead of her and his voice at her back, and she thought about a Tuesday evening in October years ago, in a different corridor, making a different choice. "No," she said. "I didn't." She turned her head, not fully, just enough. "But the last time I stood in a room with evidence and a smiling man, I walked away. People were hurt. I have carried that for 3 years. A beat. I was not going to walk away twice." She pushed the door open and walked through it. 3 days passed. She worked her shifts. The restaurant had the particular quality of a space from which something heavy had recently been removed. Not visibly different. Not quieter, but lighter in the way that rooms are lighter after a window long painted shut is finally opened. Her co-workers treated her with a new, careful deference that nobody acknowledged directly. She tied on her apron every morning with the same hands she had always had. On the 4th morning, there was an envelope in her locker, no name on the outside, just her locker number, written in a hand she did not recognize until she thought about it. Inside, a folded card, 2 lines in both Korean and English, written by hand with the economy of someone for whom written words are a considered expense. "Min-jun will not concern you again. If you ever decide to stop being invisible, I will remember your name." She read it twice. She put it in the pocket where she kept her test kit. She stood in the staff changing room for a moment and breathed. She called Bissy that evening. Bissy, who called every Sunday and asked careful questions and never pushed, and had been the single fixed point of warmth in 3 years of deliberate isolation. She told her everything this time. The dinner, the glass, the test strip in the storage room, the car and the concrete steps and the conference room and the door. Bissy was quiet for a long time, long enough that Zara thought the call had dropped. "Zara," Bissy said finally, "I know. You absolute impossible, ridiculous. I know. I love you so much." And then she was laughing, and Zara was laughing too, in the way that laughter happens when the alternative is 3 years of accumulated grief finally finding the exit, sudden and enormous and entirely beyond management. That same evening, walking to the subway, she passed the window of a coffee shop across from the restaurant entrance. She saw his car, parked, not running, not threatening, not positioned in the way of a man conducting surveillance, just there, present, the way he had been present on that back staircase when she had told him the truth about herself. She did not pretend she hadn't seen it. She stopped walking. She turned and looked directly at the tinted rear window for 3 seconds, not in challenge, not in invitation, in acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of 2 people who have told each other things that cannot be unfiled. Then she kept walking, and for the first time in 3 years, not a smile exactly, not the performance of happiness, but the thing that exists before smiles, the small interior warmth of a person who has been walking alone in a cold city for a very long time and has just, unexpectedly, felt something like a hand. Kang Jae-won, in the penthouse above the city that represented everything he had built at a cost he had long ago decided not to count, poured himself a drink that night from a new bottle. His own hand, his own choice. No security in the room, no one stationed between him and harm. He had done this 10,000 times. He did this every night. Tonight, for the first time in 15 years, he did not scan the room before he raised the glass to his lips. He sat at the window. The city spread below him in all directions, a map of territory and influence and years of calculated risk, every light a testament to someone's decision to choose him over the alternative, every shadow a reminder of the alternative's persistence. He had built this. He had built it alone, in the way that men who cannot ask for help build everything, through the accumulation of leverage, through the patient management of other people's needs and fears, through the gradual construction of a position so fortified that vulnerability became, eventually, simply unaffordable. He thought about a woman on a concrete staircase with a container of rice and her eyes on the river. His phone buzzed, an unknown number, not a blocked number which his security would have intercepted, but an unknown one, which meant it had come through a channel nobody was monitoring yet. A single message, no greeting, no signature, no context. She is not just a waitress. Ask her what happened in Lab 7. He sat without moving for a long time. The city moved below him, indifferent and continuous. He read the message 3 more times. He thought about the 40-page report she had mentioned. He thought about the institute. He thought about the specific thing she had not told him. The part of the story where she had gone from dismissed employee to woman who couldn't get hired in her field, the gap between the 14-day termination and the 3 years of waitressing that had never quite added up to a complete story. Lab 7. He set the phone down. He looked at the city. He thought, Dr. Zara Adeyemi, who are you really? What did they take from you that was bigger than the job? What do you know that someone powerful enough to close a regulatory investigation in 11 days decided was too dangerous to leave in your hands? And somewhere in Seoul tonight, in a clean, unremarkable office in a building whose name appears on no syndicate documentation, a man who had known the answer to these questions for 3 years was making a phone call of his own, deciding with the particular deliberation of someone who has been patient long enough Whether the woman who survived the first attempt to silence her was now protected enough to be worth the effort of a second one, or whether she had just made an alliance powerful enough that touching her would cost more than she was worth. He looked at the new number on his screen. He had not decided yet. And Kang Jae-won, 20 floors above the city, set down his glass and picked up his phone, and for the first time in a very long time, asked a question he did not already know the answer to. Here is what we are leaving you with tonight. A woman who did the right thing and was destroyed for it, who rebuilt herself in silence and invisibility and 3 years of careful, quiet survival, has just stepped back into the light. Not because she was ready, not because it was safe, because some wounds do not close until you return to the moment they opened and do, this time, the thing you should have done. She has an ally now. One of the most powerful, most dangerous men in Seoul has decided, for reasons he does not entirely understand yet, that she is under his protection. But here is the question, and we want you to sit with this. Is Kang Jae-won's protection a gift, or is it a cage so beautiful she won't see the walls until it is too late? Is she safer inside his orbit, or has she simply exchanged one powerful man's silence for another powerful man's ownership? And what is in Lab 7? If you want to find out, you already know what to do. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment right now. Team Zara, Team Kang, or Team Truth, because Part 2 is coming and nothing will be what it looks like. This is Soul of Africa. We will see you there.